The help uses the back door. The words were spoken loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, and the moment they left the CEO's lips, a 10-year-old girl tightened her grip on her father's hand. The grand entrance of the Whitmore Grand Hotel glowed beneath crystal lights and polished brass fixtures. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant evening gowns climbed the marble steps toward one of the most exclusive charity galas in Washington. Everything about the evening was designed to celebrate influence, success, and power. But sometimes the clearest measure of character appears long before anyone enters the ballroom. Caleb Turner stood quietly at the foot of the entrance stairs beside his daughter, Grace. His dark suit was clean, but several years old. His shoes had been polished carefully that afternoon. He looked respectable, though not wealthy. The kind of man most people would pass without remembering. Grace wore a simple blue dress she had spent an hour choosing in front of her bedroom mirror. To her, tonight felt magical. To Caleb, it was simply a chance to keep a promise. Months earlier, he had told Grace that no matter how difficult life became, they would still find reasons to believe good people existed. The charity gala had seemed like a good place to prove it. They had barely reached the entrance when a sharp voice stopped them. Madison Whitmore stood near the front doors greeting sponsors and special guests. Her silver evening gown shimmered beneath the lights. Cameras flashed around her. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in every room. Her eyes moved over Caleb from head to toe. Then they settled on Grace. For a moment, her smile disappeared. "Excuse me," Madison said. Caleb stopped. "Yes, ma'am." Madison pointed toward a service corridor running along the side of the building. The help uses the back door. The surrounding conversations grew quieter. Not silent, just quiet enough. Quiet enough for people to listen. Quiet enough for Grace to hear every word. Caleb blinked once. Nothing more. No anger crossed his face. No argument followed. He simply looked at Madison as though giving her an opportunity to reconsider. She did not. "This entrance is reserved for guests," she added. A few people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to notice. That was often easier. Grace looked up at her father. The hurt in her eyes appeared instantly. Children understand humiliation faster than adults realize. Caleb felt it like a weight pressing against his chest. Not for himself. For her. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket. Madison seemed to expect a confrontation. Instead, Caleb calmly removed an invitation envelope. Before he could open it, another guest approached Madison with a camera crew. Her attention immediately shifted away. The conversation was over in her mind. Caleb looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he quietly slid it back into his pocket. "Dad," Grace whispered. He knelt beside her, so they were eye level. "You okay?" She hesitated. "I think so." The lights from the hotel reflected in her eyes. "Did we do something wrong?" Caleb forced a gentle smile. "No, sweetheart." Then why did she say that? For a moment, he searched for the right answer. Around them, luxury cars continued arriving. Laughter drifted from the entrance. Somewhere beyond the massive doors, music had already begun playing. Yet all Caleb could focus on was the question in his daughter's voice. And as he looked back toward the crowded entrance where nobody seemed willing to challenge what had just happened, he realized this night was becoming about something far more important than a charity gala. Grace's question lingered in the cool evening air long after the noise of the arriving guests faded into the background. Did we do something wrong? Caleb looked at his daughter and felt a familiar ache. Not the ache of being insulted. He had endured worse things in life than careless words from a stranger. What hurt was watching a child encounter unfairness for the first time. The kind of unfairness that could quietly reshape the way she viewed herself if nobody helped her understand it. He gently adjusted a loose strand of hair behind Grace's ear and smiled. "No, sweetheart. We did absolutely nothing wrong." Grace studied his face. Children had a remarkable ability to detect dishonesty. Then why did she think that? Caleb glanced toward the brightly lit entrance where Madison was now laughing with donors and photographers as though nothing unusual had happened. Sometimes people decide who someone is before they know anything about them. Grace frowned. That does not seem very smart. A soft laugh escaped him. "No, it usually is not." They stood together for a moment beneath the glow of the hotel lights. Luxury vehicles continued arriving one after another. Valets hurried across the driveway. Music drifted through the entrance every time the doors opened. Everything around them projected success, influence, and prestige. Yet Caleb found himself thinking about a lesson he had spent years trying to teach Grace. Character reveals itself most clearly when nobody important appears to be watching. The irony was impossible to miss. Tonight, hundreds of important people were present, yet very few seemed willing to see what had just happened. Grace looked toward the side corridor Madison had pointed to earlier. Do we have to use that door? Caleb followed her gaze. Employees carrying supplies occasionally disappeared through the service entrance. Event staff moved in and out while preparing for the evening. He thought about the invitation sitting inside his jacket pocket. He thought about walking back to Madison and proving she was wrong. He thought about explaining exactly why they belonged there. Instead, he shook his head. No. Grace blinked. No. We are not going through the back door. Then what are we going to do? Caleb smiled. We are going to walk through the same door as everyone else. Her eyes widened slightly. Even after what she said, Caleb stood and straightened his jacket. Especially after what she said. Something about the answer seemed to reassure her. The sadness did not disappear completely, but it softened. Nearby, several guests who had witnessed the exchange continued stealing glances toward them. Some looked uncomfortable. Others appeared curious. A few simply avoided eye contact altogether. Caleb recognized that reaction. People often preferred silence when speaking up carried even the smallest social risk. He held no anger toward them. Only disappointment. As they began walking toward the entrance again, Grace slipped her hand into his. The simple gesture brought a smile to his face. For years, it had been just the two of them navigating life together. Since losing his wife, Caleb had learned that strength was rarely loud. Most days it looked like showing up, paying bills, keeping promises, being present when your child needed reassurance. The world celebrated dramatic victories. Real courage often looked much quieter. They reached the bottom of the marble staircase once more. This time Caleb noticed something he had missed earlier. One of the security officers standing near the entrance was watching him. Not casually, intently. The officer appeared to recognize him. For a brief moment, confusion crossed the man's face. Then surprise. Then something else. Respect. Caleb immediately looked away. The officer reached toward the radio attached to his shoulder. Then paused. Their eyes met for a split second. Caleb gave the slightest shake of his head. The officer froze. A strange understanding seemed to pass between them. Then the man slowly lowered his hand. Grace noticed none of it. She was too busy gathering the courage to climb the stairs again. But as Caleb guided her toward the entrance, he could not shake the feeling that this night was unfolding according to a story far larger than either of them had expected. The strange exchange with the security officer stayed in Caleb's mind as he and Grace climbed the marble staircase. The officer had clearly recognized him. There had been no doubt about that. Yet Caleb had discouraged him from saying anything, and the man had immediately understood. It was not the first time something like that had happened. Over the years, Caleb had learned that the less attention he attracted, the more peaceful life became. Tonight, however, peace seemed determined to stay out of reach. The massive glass doors opened before them. Warm light spilled across the entrance. Inside, the ballroom looked like something from a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings nearly 40 feet overhead. White linen-covered tables stretched across the room. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Business leaders, politicians, donors, and public figures filled the space with carefully practiced smiles and polished conversations. Grace stopped walking for a moment. Wow. Caleb smiled. Pretty impressive. Do you think they have chocolate cake? At a fundraiser this expensive? He glanced around. They probably have 6 kinds. That finally earned a grin from her. Yet even as they stepped inside, Caleb felt the weight of dozens of eyes. Word had traveled faster than he expected. Several guests near the entrance recognized him as the man Madison had confronted outside. Some looked curious. Others looked amused. A few appeared sympathetic. None said anything. Madison stood across the ballroom near a cluster of sponsors. She noticed Caleb immediately. For a split second, surprise flashed across her face. She had not expected him to enter through the front doors after all. Then her expression hardened. The moment passed, but Caleb saw it. So did Grace. "Dad," Grace whispered. "She is looking at us again." Caleb squeezed her hand gently. "Then let us give her something better to look at." "Like what?" "Good manners." Grace laughed despite herself. Together, they moved farther into the ballroom. The atmosphere felt elegant on the surface, but beneath the music and conversation, Caleb sensed something else. Pressure. Anticipation. The kind of energy that appears when important people are waiting for something significant to happen. Several television crews were setting up near the stage. Additional security personnel stood along the walls. Event organizers moved quickly between tables carrying clipboards and earpieces. Whatever tonight's main event was, it clearly extended beyond an ordinary charity fundraiser. Grace soon became distracted by the dessert display exactly as Caleb predicted. While she admired an entire table dedicated to pastries, Caleb found himself studying the room. Years of experience had trained him to notice details others overlooked. Security positions, exit routes, communication patterns, small changes in behavior. The habits remained even though he rarely thought about them anymore. That was when he noticed another unusual thing. Two security agents near the stage were looking directly at him. One said something into an earpiece. The other immediately turned toward Caleb. Their reaction was subtle enough that most guests would never notice. Caleb noticed. One of the agents even started walking in his direction before an organizer interrupted him with a question. The moment was brief, but it left Caleb uneasy. Across the ballroom, Madison continued greeting influential guests. Yet she occasionally glanced toward him as well. Not with curiosity, with irritation. As though his presence itself represented a problem she had not anticipated. Grace returned carrying a small plate. Mission accomplished. Caleb looked down. That is a lot of chocolate cake. I am supporting the fundraiser. He laughed. Of course you are. As they shared the moment, the lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed slightly. Conversations softened. Several guests began moving toward their assigned tables. The string quartet stopped playing. Near the stage, a large screen illuminated with the event logo. Something important was about to begin. Yet before anyone could take their seats, one of the security agents Caleb had noticed earlier finally broke away from the crowd and started walking directly toward him with an expression that looked far more serious than simple recognition. The security agent moved through the crowd with purpose, weaving between tables as conversations gradually faded around him. Caleb saw him coming long before anyone else noticed. Years ago, he would have instinctively analyzed every possibility. Tonight, he simply hoped the man would keep walking. Grace was still enjoying her chocolate cake when the agent finally stopped a few feet away. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. The agent's expression shifted between professionalism and disbelief. Then he smiled. It was small, respectful, and completely genuine. Good evening, sir. Caleb nodded politely. Good evening. The agent seemed about to say more when another voice interrupted from across the ballroom. Is there a problem? Madison Whitmore had noticed the interaction. She was already walking toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Several nearby guests turned to watch. The agent immediately straightened. No problem, ma'am. Madison folded her arms. Then why are you standing here? The question was directed at the agent, but her eyes remained fixed on Caleb. The atmosphere tightened. Conversations nearby slowed. People sensed tension the way sailors sense an approaching storm. The agent carefully chose his words. I was simply checking to make sure everyone was comfortable. Madison glanced toward Caleb's older suit, and then toward Grace holding her dessert plate. Her expression suggested she found the explanation unnecessary. I am sure they are fine. The message beneath the words was impossible to miss. The agent noticed it too. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, ma'am. Before he could continue, another organizer approached him urgently and whispered something into his ear. The agent immediately excused himself and walked away, though not before giving Caleb one last curious look. Madison watched him leave. Then she turned back toward Caleb. Interesting. Caleb remained calm. What is? Security seems unusually interested in you. Grace shifted slightly closer to her father. Madison noticed. Do you know him? Caleb smiled politely. I think he was just being professional. Madison studied him for a moment. She clearly did not believe that answer. Yet before she could press further, another guest approached her requesting a photograph. Once again, her attention moved elsewhere. As she walked away, Caleb heard one man quietly ask another who he was. Neither seemed to know. Grace looked up at him. Dad, why did that security officer seem surprised to see you? Caleb considered the question. Sometimes people think they recognize someone. Did he? Maybe. Grace accepted the answer even though it explained almost nothing. Children often knew when adults were protecting information. The ballroom lights dimmed another level. Music faded completely. Event staff began encouraging guests to take their seats. Excitement spread through the room. Whatever announcement everyone had been anticipating appeared close. Caleb glanced toward the stage. Large screens displayed patriotic imagery mixed with the Charity Foundation's logo. Additional security personnel quietly took positions near exits and side entrances. The preparations felt larger than a fundraiser. Much larger. Around them, influential guests settled into seats near the front. CEOs, politicians, donors, public figures. Madison occupied a prominent table only a few yards from the stage itself. It was clear she expected to play an important role in the evening's events. Caleb and Grace found seats much farther back. Neither complained. Grace seemed content simply to be there. Yet as they settled into their chairs, she suddenly asked a question that caught him off guard. "Dad, have people always treated you like this?" Caleb looked at her. The sadness had returned to her voice. Not anger. Sadness. That somehow hurt more. He took a slow breath. "Not always. But sometimes." He nodded. Grace stared toward the stage lights glowing in the darkness. "I do not like it." Caleb gently placed a hand over hers. "Neither do I." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind shared by people who trust each other completely. Then, from somewhere near the stage entrance, a burst of activity erupted among the security teams. Heads turned. Earpieces crackled. Several agents suddenly moved into position at once. Whatever everyone had been waiting for was no longer approaching. It had arrived. A wave of movement swept across the ballroom as security personnel subtly shifted positions. Conversations faded into whispers. Every head seemed to turn toward the side entrance near the stage. The atmosphere changed instantly. It was no longer a charity gala. It felt like the room was holding its breath. Grace noticed it too. She sat up straighter in her chair. "Something big is happening." Caleb nodded. "Looks that way." Across the ballroom, executives adjusted their jackets. Donors straightened in their seats. Camera operators moved into place with practiced efficiency. Even Madison Whitmore appeared more focused than before. Her confidence remained intact, but there was a new energy behind her smile. Anticipation. Expectation. She clearly believed tonight would strengthen her already impressive reputation. A master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Applause followed. He welcomed guests, thanked sponsors, and spoke about the foundation's mission. Most people listened politely. Others glanced repeatedly toward the secured entrance. Everyone knew the real reason for the heightened security. The evening's special guest had not yet appeared. Grace leaned closer to Caleb. "Do you think the president is really coming?" Caleb smiled. "That seems to be the rumor." Her eyes widened. "Have you ever met a president before?" The question caught him by surprise. For a second, memories flickered behind his eyes. Places he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Rooms filled with decisions. Conversations never discussed publicly. Long days and longer nights. Then the memories disappeared as quickly as they came. "A long time ago," he said quietly. Grace looked impressed. "Really?" Caleb shrugged. "It was not as exciting as people imagine." She laughed softly. "Everything sounds more exciting than you make it sound." Before he could answer, movement near the stage drew his attention. The same security agent who had approached him earlier was now speaking with two other agents. All three glanced toward Caleb at different moments during the conversation. The behavior was subtle, but impossible for him to miss. One of the agents appeared skeptical. Another looked surprised. The first agent looked certain. Caleb immediately looked away. He did not want attention. Not tonight. Not ever. Yet attention seemed to be moving toward him whether he wanted it or not. Across the room, Madison was receiving congratulations from donors seated nearby. Several appeared eager to position themselves close to her before the guest of honor arrived. She handled every interaction with polished confidence. Yet every so often her gaze drifted back toward Caleb's table. The curiosity in her expression had grown stronger. Perhaps she remembered the unusual attention from security. Perhaps she simply disliked unanswered questions. Whatever the reason, she could not completely ignore him. The host continued speaking. A video presentation played across the giant screens. Guests applauded at appropriate moments. Yet beneath the formal program, another story seemed to be unfolding quietly in the background. Caleb could feel it. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when people were communicating without words. Security personnel exchanged glances. Event staff whispered into radios. Organizers checked schedules repeatedly. Something unexpected had complicated the evening's plans. Then it happened again. One of the senior security agents emerged from a side corridor and immediately scanned the ballroom. His eyes moved across hundreds of guests before stopping directly on Caleb. Recognition flashed across his face. Unlike the others, he did not try to hide it. For a moment, the man looked as though he wanted to approach immediately. Instead, he spoke into an earpiece and remained where he was. Caleb felt a familiar sense of unease settle into his chest. Grace noticed his expression. "Dad, nothing. That means it is something." He smiled despite himself. "You are getting too good at reading me." She grinned. "I learned from the best." The lights dimmed once more. The giant screens faded to black. The room fell silent. Near the stage entrance, a line of security agents suddenly formed. Every guest turned toward the doorway. Every conversation stopped. And somewhere beyond those doors, the arrival everyone had been waiting for had finally reached the building. The ballroom fell completely silent as the secured doors near the stage opened. Every guest instinctively sat straighter. Camera operators raised their equipment. Organizers exchanged relieved glances. The atmosphere carried the unmistakable weight of a moment people would remember long after the evening ended. Grace leaned forward in her chair. "I think this is it." Caleb nodded, though his attention was divided. Part of him watched the stage. Another part remained aware of the unusual attention he continued receiving from members of the security detail. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The first members of the presidential advance team entered the room. Dark suits, earpieces, calm, controlled movements. They spread across the perimeter with quiet efficiency. Several guests immediately began whispering. Excitement rippled through the crowd like a wave. Near the front tables, Madison Whitmore's smile widened. She adjusted a bracelet and exchanged confident remarks with several donors seated nearby. She clearly expected to play a visible role in what came next. The master of ceremonies stepped forward once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your support of this foundation and its mission. Tonight we are honored by the presence of a distinguished guest." Applause filled the room before he could continue. The anticipation had become almost tangible. Yet Caleb noticed something strange. The senior security agent he had seen earlier was no longer watching the stage. Instead, the man's attention remained fixed on Caleb's section of the ballroom. Every few moments he glanced toward him as though waiting for instructions that had not yet arrived. Grace followed the applause and smiled. "This is probably the fanciest place I have ever been." Caleb laughed softly. "You said that about the county science fair. That was different." "How?" "The science fair only had one chocolate fountain." Despite everything that had happened, her ability to find joy in small things remained intact. Caleb was grateful for that. More grateful than she could possibly know. Across the ballroom, the applause faded. A side door opened again. More members of the security team entered. Guests rose from their seats. The expected arrival seemed seconds away. Yet something unexpected interrupted the carefully planned sequence. One of the agents approached the senior officer and whispered urgently into his ear. The officer's expression changed immediately. Not alarm. Recognition. He looked across the ballroom once more, directly toward Caleb. Then he nodded. The younger agent followed his gaze. His eyes widened slightly. For a brief second, the younger man appeared stunned. Caleb noticed the reaction. So did no one else. Grace tugged gently on his sleeve. "Dad." "Yes." "Why do those security people keep looking over here?" Caleb hesitated. "I am not sure." It was technically true. He understood recognition. He did not understand why it seemed to matter tonight. Before Grace could ask another question, movement near the stage captured everyone's attention. A group of local officials entered first. Applause followed. Then senior foundation members appeared. More applause. The evening's formal presentation was beginning. Madison took her place near the front row. Cameras frequently pointed in her direction. She appeared completely at ease. Yet every so often she still glanced toward Caleb's table. The curiosity had evolved into irritation mixed with confusion. She could not understand why security personnel seemed interested in a man she had dismissed within seconds of meeting him. The host began introducing sponsors and major contributors. Names appeared on giant screens. Guests applauded politely. Minutes passed, yet the most important arrival still had not happened. The delay created a subtle tension throughout the ballroom. Organizers whispered among themselves. Security teams adjusted positions. Even the host looked increasingly nervous. Then, just as another introduction concluded, the senior security officer received a message through his earpiece. His posture changed instantly. Around the room, agents straightened. Conversations stopped. Every head turned toward the secured entrance. This time there was no mistaking it. Whoever had finally arrived was the person everyone had been waiting for. And as the doors slowly began to open once again, the senior officer's eyes drifted toward Caleb one more time, carrying a look that suggested the night was about to become far more complicated than anyone in the ballroom could imagine. The ballroom rose to its feet as the doors finally opened. Applause erupted almost instantly. Camera flashes reflected across crystal chandeliers. Guests craned their necks for a better view. Months of planning, fundraising, and anticipation had led to this moment. Yet while most eyes focused on the entrance itself, Caleb noticed something entirely different. The senior security officer had stopped watching the doorway. He was watching him. The realization settled heavily in Caleb's chest. Not because he was afraid, because he understood how unusual it was. Security professionals rarely became distracted during an arrival of this importance. Yet several of them seemed unable to stop glancing toward his table. Grace stood beside him with everyone else. "Can you see?" she whispered. "A little." The crowd near the front partially blocked their view. The first members of the presidential entourage entered. Additional agents followed. Local officials lined up near the stage. Applause continued. Madison Whitmore appeared radiant under the ballroom lights. She stood near the front row, perfectly positioned for cameras and introductions. Every detail of the evening seemed designed to place influential people exactly where they wanted to be. The president had not appeared yet, but everyone knew he was only moments away. Then something unexpected happened. One of the senior agents stepped away from the security formation and crossed the ballroom floor. Not toward the stage, not toward Madison, toward Caleb. Conversations nearest his table began to fade. Guests watched discreetly. Grace noticed the approaching figure and looked up at her father. "That man is coming back." Caleb nodded. "I see him." The agent stopped beside their table and lowered his voice. "Good evening, sir." His tone carried unmistakable respect. Not courtesy, respect. Caleb offered a polite smile. "Good evening." The agent hesitated briefly as though choosing his next words with extreme care. "I wanted to make sure you and your daughter are comfortable." Grace glanced between them. Caleb remained calm. "We are doing fine." The agent nodded. Relief crossed his face. "That is good to hear." Before he could continue, another voice interrupted from nearby. "What exactly is going on here?" Madison Whitmore had noticed the interaction again. Several guests around her immediately turned to listen. The agent straightened. Madison approached with measured confidence. "You seem unusually interested in this table tonight." The ballroom noise continued around them, but the small circle surrounding the conversation felt isolated from everything else. The agent maintained his professionalism. "Just performing my duties, ma'am." Madison folded her arms. "Your duties involve checking on random guests multiple times?" A few nearby donors exchanged glances. The question was reasonable. The answer, however, appeared far more complicated than Madison realized. The agent looked toward Caleb briefly before responding. "Everyone's safety matters." Madison's eyes narrowed slightly. She clearly sensed there was more beneath the surface. Caleb wished the conversation would end. Attention had never been comfortable for him. Grace quietly moved closer to his side. The agent noticed and offered her a reassuring smile. Then his radio crackled. His expression changed immediately. "Excuse me." Without another word, he stepped away and returned toward the secured entrance. Madison watched him leave. The confusion on her face had deepened. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain. Not threatened, not worried, simply unable to understand what she was seeing. Across the ballroom, organizers suddenly became more animated. Security teams adjusted positions again. The applause near the entrance grew louder. This time there was no mistaking it. The president had arrived. Guests surged with excitement. Cameras swung toward the doorway. Madison immediately turned and composed herself for the moment she had clearly been anticipating all evening. Yet as Caleb watched the crowd focus on the entrance, he noticed something else. The senior security officer had just spoken into his radio. Then he looked across the ballroom directly at Caleb and gave the smallest nod. It lasted less than a second. Most people never would have noticed it. Caleb did. And for the first time that evening, he began to suspect that the night was moving towards something neither Madison nor anyone else in the room could possibly predict. The applause surged through the ballroom as the president finally entered the room. Guests rose to their feet. Camera flashes illuminated the chandeliers overhead. Conversations disappeared beneath the sound of celebration. For months, perhaps years, many people in that room had dreamed of standing close enough to shake his hand. Tonight, they believed that opportunity had arrived. Grace stood on the tips of her shoes, trying to see over the crowd. "I can barely see him." Caleb smiled and gently moved aside so she could stand in front of him. "Better." "Much." The president moved slowly through the entrance area, accompanied by agents and officials. His smile appeared relaxed, practiced, familiar. Guests near the front seemed almost breathless with excitement. Several held out hands. Others called his name. Every camera in the room tracked his movement. Madison Whitmore stood perfectly positioned near the front aisle. Her confidence had fully returned. The evening was finally unfolding according to expectations. She exchanged a few final words with nearby donors and adjusted her posture. From where she stood, she was one of the first major sponsors the president would encounter. Everything about the moment suggested recognition, prestige, and visibility. Yet as Caleb watched from the back of the ballroom, something felt unusual. It began with the security team. Their formation shifted subtly. Agents exchanged brief glances. The senior officer Caleb had noticed all evening remained focused not on the crowd, but on the president himself. More specifically, he seemed to be waiting for something. Then the president entered the main aisle. Applause intensified. Madison smiled broadly. Several guests leaned forward. Organizers looked relieved. The evening's most important moment had seemingly arrived. Yet after only a few steps, the president slowed. His eyes moved across the room. Not casually, deliberately. He appeared to be searching for someone. The change was subtle enough that most people missed it. Caleb did not. Neither did the senior security officer. The president continued scanning the crowd. His smile softened. His pace slowed further. Nearby officials exchanged puzzled glances. Madison maintained her confident expression, though uncertainty briefly flickered across her face. She noticed it too. The president was looking for something. Or someone. Grace tugged on Caleb's sleeve. "Dad." "Yes." "Why does it look like he is trying to find somebody?" Caleb followed the president's gaze. "I do not know." It was not entirely true. Deep inside, a quiet suspicion had begun forming, one he immediately tried to dismiss. Across the ballroom, the president reached the area where Madison and several sponsors stood waiting. Applause erupted once again. Cameras concentrated on the group. This was the image everyone expected to see. Yet something strange happened. The president acknowledged them politely, but did not stop. He continued moving. Madison's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The cameras followed. So did the crowd's attention. The president took several more steps. Then several more. Conversations stopped. Confusion spread through the ballroom. Guests turned their heads trying to understand where he was going. Organizers whispered nervously. The carefully planned sequence of events seemed to be drifting away from the script. At the back of the room, Caleb felt his stomach tighten. Grace looked up at him. "Dad, people are staring." She was right. More and more eyes were turning toward their section of the ballroom. Not because anyone understood what was happening, because nobody did. The president's path no longer made sense. He continued walking past donors, executives, public officials, and honored guests. Madison slowly turned to follow him with her eyes. Her confusion was now impossible to hide. The senior security officer near the stage spoke quietly into his radio and then glanced toward Caleb once more. This time there was no uncertainty in his expression, only confirmation. The president was getting closer. Conversations had completely stopped. Hundreds of guests watched in silence. Grace squeezed her father's hand. Caleb remained perfectly still. And as the president moved farther away from the spotlight and deeper into the crowd, the entire ballroom seemed to realize that the most important moment of the evening was no longer happening on the stage. The ballroom stood frozen as the president continued walking past executives, donors, and dignitaries. Every carefully planned expectation dissolved with each step he took. Madison Whitmore watched in disbelief. The cameras that had been focused on the front row slowly followed him deeper into the room. Guests turned in their chairs. Conversations vanished completely. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether to continue playing. Grace tightened her grip on Caleb's hand. "Dad," she whispered. "He is coming this way." Caleb remained still. His heartbeat quickened despite his efforts to stay calm. The distance between them grew smaller. 20 feet. 15. 10. Then the president stopped directly in front of him. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed suspended in silence. The president smiled. Not the formal smile he had worn for cameras all evening. A genuine one. Warm. Personal. Familiar. Then he extended his hand. Caleb Turner. The room did not merely become quiet. It became motionless. Caleb slowly accepted the handshake. "Mr. President." The president laughed softly. "After all these years, you still say it like that." Grace looked between them with wide eyes. Madison stared from across the ballroom, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The president kept hold of Caleb's hand for an extra moment before speaking again. His voice carried clearly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I have wanted to thank you properly for a very long time." A wave of confusion spread across the room. The president turned slightly toward Grace. "And this must be your daughter." Grace nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Your father is one of the finest men I have ever known." Tears immediately filled Grace's eyes. Not because she fully understood what was happening, but because she understood what those words meant to her father. The president looked back at Caleb. "When others stepped away, you stayed. When difficult decisions had to be made, you never looked for credit. You protected people you would never meet and asked for nothing in return." The ballroom listened in stunned silence. No titles were announced. No accomplishments were listed. Yet somehow the respect in the president's voice carried more weight than any biography ever could. Madison's expression changed. The confidence that had defined her all evening slowly disappeared. In its place came realization. She remembered the entrance, the words she had spoken, the assumptions she had made. For the first time that night, she truly saw Caleb. Not his suit, not his appearance, not his old shoes. Him. The president finally released Caleb's hand and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Good to see you again, my friend." Then he moved toward the stage. The crowd remained silent for another few seconds before applause erupted across the ballroom. Not polite applause, genuine applause. The kind that comes when people recognize something real. Grace looked up at her father. "You know the president?" Caleb smiled. "A little." She laughed through her tears. That was definitely not a little. Later, after the presentation ended and guests began gathering in smaller groups, Madison approached them. The confidence was gone. Her voice was quieter than Caleb had heard all evening. "Mr. Turner." Caleb turned toward her. "Yes." She hesitated. "I owe you an apology." The words clearly cost her something. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I was wrong." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he glanced down at Grace. "The person who deserves the apology most is my daughter." Madison nodded immediately. She crouched slightly to meet Grace's eyes. "I am sorry for what I said earlier." Grace studied her for a moment and then offered a small smile. "It is okay." Madison looked relieved. Caleb smiled gently. There was no anger in him, no desire for revenge, only a quiet understanding that dignity never needed to shout. As they left the ballroom later that night, Grace slipped her hand into his once again. "Dad, yes, I think you were right." "About what?" She smiled. "Good people still exist." Caleb looked back at the glowing hotel behind them and then toward the stars above the city skyline. "Yes, sweetheart, they do. And sometimes the strongest people in the room are not the loudest, the richest, or the most powerful. Sometimes they are simply the ones who choose kindness when nobody is watching." If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us about someone whose quiet dignity inspired you. And if you believe respect should be given before status is known, consider subscribing for more stories about grace, character, and the extraordinary power of treating people with kindness.